In February 2025, Microsoft held a press event and announced something that it described as one of the most significant milestones in the history of computing. The company said it had built the world's first quantum processor powered by topological qubits. It called the chip Majorana 1. It showed diagrams. It published a paper in Nature. Satya Nadella posted about it. The stock price moved. Tech headlines around the world celebrated the breakthrough. And then, almost immediately, the scientific community began picking it apart. Physicists who had spent careers studying the exact phenomenon Microsoft claimed to have discovered started raising questions. Then, formal critiques appeared. Then, in June 2026, Nature published a peer-reviewed scientific challenge to Microsoft's core claims, and the researcher who wrote it said something that cut straight through the corporate PR. Microsoft had built what they claimed was a precision Swiss watch. But when he opened the case to examine the mechanism, he found what looked like a chaotic jumble of mismatched parts. Something was making noise, he said, but it did not look like the breakthrough Microsoft had claimed. What had happened was not just a scientific disagreement, it was the most public and consequential exposure of a pattern that has defined Microsoft's quantum computing program for years. A pattern of ambitious announcements, scientific skepticism, retractions, and then more announcements. And understanding this pattern tells you something important, not just about Microsoft, but about the entire field of quantum computing, and why the gap between what companies say and what the physics actually confirms can be so dangerously wide. Like and subscribe right now, because this story goes back further than most people know, and it has not finished unfolding. To understand what Microsoft is actually trying to do with Majorana 1 and why it is so controversial, you need to understand the basic problem with every quantum computer that currently exists. The fundamental challenge in quantum computing is that qubits are fragile. A qubit is a quantum system that encodes information in a quantum state, and that quantum state can be destroyed by almost any interaction with the environment. Heat from the room, electromagnetic interference from nearby electronics, cosmic rays passing through the building. Even the act of measuring a qubit can destroy the quantum state it was in. This fragility is called decoherence, and it is the reason why today's quantum computers have error rates high enough to limit their usefulness for long calculations. Most approaches to quantum computing deal with decoherence through error correction, using many physical qubits to protect one logical qubit and running continuous error detection and correction cycles in real time. This works, but it is enormously resource intensive. A single reliable logical qubit might require thousands of physical qubits to protect it. Microsoft decided decades ago to pursue a fundamentally different strategy. Instead of building noisy qubits and correcting the errors. Afterward, Microsoft's approach was to build a type of qubit that is inherently resistant to noise in the first place. The theoretical basis for this approach comes from a class of exotic quantum particles called Majorana zero modes, sometimes called Majorana fermions, after the Italian physicist Ettore Majorana, who theorized their existence in the 1930s. Majorana zero modes are quasi-particles, meaning they are not individual particles, but collective quantum states of electrons in a material that behave like particles with very unusual properties. Crucially, in theory, a qubit built from a pair of Majorana zero modes stored at opposite ends of a nanowire would encode quantum information in a way that is spread across the entire wire, rather than localized at any single point. Because the information is distributed and non-local, environmental disturbances that affect one part of the wire should not be able to disturb the encoded quantum information. The qubit would be topologically protected, meaning its quantum state would be stable, even in the presence of noise that would destroy a conventional qubit. This is an extraordinarily compelling theoretical idea. If it works, topological qubits would not just be incrementally better than conventional qubits. They would be qualitatively different, far more stable, requiring far fewer physical qubits per logical qubit, and enabling quantum computers to scale without the error correction overhead that makes other approaches so resource intensive. Microsoft has been pursuing this nearly 20 years, employing some of the world's leading physicists and spending hundreds of millions of dollars on the effort. The problem is that demonstrating Majorana zero modes experimentally has proven extraordinarily difficult, and the history of those attempts is a history Microsoft's current program cannot escape. In 2018, a team of researchers at Delft University of Technology in the Netherlands, working closely with Microsoft, published a paper in Nature claiming they had detected Majorana zero modes for the first time. The paper was widely celebrated. It was cited thousands of times. It appeared to validate the entire theoretical framework on which Microsoft's quantum strategy depended. And then, 3 years later, in 2021, the paper was retracted. An internal investigation found that the authors had selectively plotted their data, and that the original raw data did not support the conclusions they had published. The physical signatures they had interpreted as evidence of Majorana zero modes were, as Henry Legg and other researchers argued, explainable by disorder in the device, not by the exotic topological physics Microsoft needed to demonstrate. It was a humbling moment for a research program that had spent years building on those experimental results. Microsoft promised more stringent verification protocols. It committed to rebuilding the experimental program with greater rigor. And it spent the next several years developing a new generation of devices and a new experimental approach it called the topological gap protocol, a software framework for identifying the specific physical signature in a device that would indicate the presence of topological quantum states. In February 2025, Microsoft unveiled Majorana 1, which it described as the world's first quantum processor powered by topological qubits. Alongside the chip announcement, Microsoft published a paper in Nature describing experiments using its topological gap protocol on nanowire devices. And almost immediately, the scientific community pointed out a critical disconnect between what Microsoft's paper actually proved and what Microsoft was telling the world in its press releases and executive statements. The Nature paper made a specific and technically narrow claim. It demonstrated that Microsoft's software protocol could identify a gap in an otherwise highly conductive nanowire, a physical signature that is consistent with, but does not definitively prove, the presence of Majorana zero modes. Nature's own peer reviewers noted explicitly in the published paper that the measurements presented do not by themselves determine whether the low energy states detected are topological. In other words, the paper did not claim what Microsoft's PR said it had claimed. The company publicly announced that it had found the Majorana particle and built topological qubits. The scientific paper it published as evidence made no such claim. When confronted with this gap, Microsoft's quantum hardware lead, Chetan Nayak, explained that the paper had been submitted in March 2024 and published a year later, and that, in the intervening month, as Microsoft had gathered additional experimental evidence that was not in the paper. That additional evidence was presented at the American Physical Society's annual meeting in March 2025. The scientists who attended were not convinced. One physicist said the device might be some sort of a qubit, but they cannot control it, and he saw no evidence it was topological. Another researcher said she was not convinced the data offered signatures of qubit behavior at all. The June 2026 Nature critique by Henry Legg formally placed all of this skepticism into the permanent scientific record. Legg's paper, published in Nature's Matters Arising section, which is the journal's designated venue for formal scientific challenges to previously published work, argued that Microsoft's claims in the 2025 paper rested on coding errors in the analysis software and a flawed tune-up protocol, and that the results were seemingly contradicted by data that Microsoft had not presented. Legg's conclusion was that the physical signatures Microsoft interpreted as evidence of topological states could be explained by trivial, non-topological phenomena. In plain language, the same experimental results that Microsoft said proved it had topological qubits could also be explained by disorder in the device with no exotic quantum physics involved at all. Microsoft published a rebuttal in the same issue of Nature defending its topological gap protocol and pointing to additional experiments not yet published that it said corroborate the topological interpretation. The scientific dispute is therefore ongoing and unresolved, but the timing was damaging in a specific way that goes beyond academic debate. Just 3 weeks before Legg's critique appeared in Nature, Microsoft had announced a successor chip called Majorana 2, claiming it incorporated 1,000 times improvement in reliability over Majorana 1, achieved with the help of AI, and that the team now expects to achieve a scalable quantum computer by 2029, cutting its original timeline in half. And like and subscribe if you want to keep following this story, because what comes next is the part where this stops being just a scientific debate and becomes a strategic problem. The pattern that Legg and other physicists are pointing to is not just about Majorana 1 and the 2025 paper. It is about a decade-long sequence of high-profile announcements, scientific challenges, and, in 2 cases, outright retractions. The 2018 Delft paper that was retracted in 2021 is the most serious entry in this record, because it was not a marginal or preliminary result. It was a flagship publication in one of the world's most prestigious scientific journals, cited thousands of times, and it turned out to be wrong. An internal investigation found data selection problems. When Microsoft announced Majorana 2 in June 2026, a physicist named Vincent Morick from Research Center Jülich described it as another step in Microsoft's almost a decade-long track record of publishing unreliable results. That is a devastating sentence from an active researcher in the field. And it echoes what Henry Legg said in his published critique, that he was simply reflecting what most in the field felt from the initial announcement and felt needed to be put into a formal scientific critique for the record. Why does this matter beyond the scientific community? Why should someone who is not a condensed matter physicist care whether Microsoft's topological gap protocol successfully identifies Majorana zero modes? The answer is twofold. The first reason is strategic. Microsoft has built its entire quantum computing roadmap on the premise that topological qubits are both achievable and superior to the superconducting qubits being pursued by Google, IBM, and OQC. If the foundational physics of topological qubits is not validated at the level the scientific community requires, Microsoft's quantum program is built on an unconfirmed foundation. Google demonstrated error correction milestones with its Willow chip using superconducting qubits, the same physical approach the field has been developing for decades with progressively better results. IBM has demonstrated logical qubits on superconducting hardware with a clear scaling roadmap. Quantinuum has shown fault-tolerant operations using trapped ion technology. All three of these approaches are built on physics that has been verified, replicated, and accepted by the scientific community. Microsoft's topological approach has not reached that threshold after more than 20 years of effort and has now had 2 retractions and a formal published scientific challenge in Nature against its most important experimental claims. The second reason this matters is the encryption threat. In the same week that Microsoft faced the Nature critique over Majorana 1, the company's own security blog published a statement accelerating its quantum safe security timeline, announcing that it now believed cryptographically relevant quantum computers could arrive sooner than previously expected, and was pushing its goal of transitioning critical products and services to post-quantum cryptography forward to, Russinovich said directly that advances in quantum research and development have shifted the risk horizon, and that the work required to prepare is significant enough that organizations need to start now. This creates a striking juxtaposition. On one hand, Microsoft's quantum hardware program is facing serious scientific questions about whether its core technological claims are valid. On the other hand, Microsoft's security division is publicly warning that quantum computers powerful enough to break current encryption may arrive sooner than expected. Both statements came from Microsoft in the same week. The irony is pointed. A company that is under scientific scrutiny for overstating the maturity of its own quantum hardware is simultaneously warning businesses to urgently prepare their encryption systems because quantum threats are closer than previously thought. To be fair to Microsoft, these are separate parts of a large organization with different perspectives and different responsibilities. The security team's warnings about the quantum threat to encryption are well-founded and consistent with what governments and standards bodies around the world are saying. The United States government has issued guidance recommending that high-risk systems adopt quantum-safe cryptography as early as 2030. France has announced it will stop certifying products without quantum-safe encryption. NIST finalized 3 post-quantum cryptographic algorithms in August 2024. The threat to existing encryption from quantum computing is real, and Microsoft's security team is right to urge organizations to begin preparing now. The scientific questions about Majorana 1 and the topological qubit program do not change that reality. What the Majorana 1 controversy does expose is something that is easy to miss when you follow quantum computing primarily through corporate announcements and financial reporting. The gap between what quantum computing companies say in their press releases and what the underlying physics has actually demonstrated at any given moment can be very large. And that gap is especially dangerous when investors, policymakers, and corporate leaders are making strategic decisions based on the corporate announcements rather than the scientific record. Microsoft is not unique in this. The entire quantum computing field has a history of premature claims, optimistic timelines, and announcements calibrated for investor excitement rather than scientific precision. But Microsoft's specific history, with 2 retracted papers and now a formal Nature critique of its flagship chip, is the most visible and consequential example of this pattern in the industry. The physicist who reviewed Microsoft's claims at the APS meeting in 2025 captured it most directly. He said the only improvement there had been was in the quality of the PR campaign, or certainly the level of the claims being made. That sentence is not just a criticism of Microsoft. It is a warning about how to read quantum computing announcements from any company that has a financial interest in convincing you their technology is further along than the physics has confirmed. Where does this leave the genuine competition in quantum computing? Google and IBM have taken the superconducting qubit approach, which is more mature, better understood, and currently capable of demonstrating results that can be independently replicated. Google's Willow chip demonstrated below-threshold error correction, meaning the error rate decrease S as the system scales up, which is the critical milestone required on the path to fault-tolerant quantum computing. IBM has a detailed public roadmap with specific qubit count and error rate targets, and a track record of hitting those targets with verifiable hardware. IonQ and Quantinuum are pursuing trapped ion approaches, with their own demonstrated results. Microsoft's topological approach remains theoretically the most compelling path to truly scalable quantum computing if it can be made to work. The potential advantage of inherently stable topological qubits over noisy qubits requiring massive error correction overhead is real and enormous. But 2 decades of effort have not yet produced a topological qubit that the broader scientific community accepts as definitively demonstrated. The June 2026 Nature critique does not close the door on Microsoft's program. Microsoft's rebuttal is in the same journal. The debate is scientific and ongoing, but the weakness that quantum has exposed in Microsoft is not primarily technical. It is the gap between the ambition of the company's claims and the evidence those claims rest on, a gap that has now appeared in the scientific record not once, but multiple times, and that makes it harder for the rest of the world to know whether Microsoft's 2029 quantum roadmap is a credible engineering commitment or another headline in a 2-decade-long sequence of announcements that the physics has not yet caught up to. There is one more dimension of this story that connects the scientific controversy to the broader business reality Microsoft faces. Microsoft entered the quantum computing race with a strategy designed to leapfrog its competitors entirely, rather than following Google and IBM into the established superconducting qubit approach and competing on incremental hardware improvements. Microsoft bet on a fundamentally different and theoretically superior architecture. If topological qubits work as theorized, Microsoft would not just catch up to competitors with a head start in superconducting hardware. It would bypass them completely. This is a bold strategy, but when it does not work on the timeline promised, it leaves the company that made the bet in a difficult position. IBM has been shipping quantum systems to clients for years. Google has demonstrated error correction milestones that the scientific community accepts. Quantinuum and IonQ have commercial customers running quantum algorithms today. Microsoft has a chip with contested physics and a 2029 promise. That asymmetry is the strategic vulnerability the Nature critique has made impossible to ignore. The financial stakes are not abstract. Microsoft spent $80 billion on AI-related capital expenditure in fiscal year 2025, with a meaningful share flowing to the topological qubit program over more than 2 decades. The quantum computing market is projected to exceed $100 billion in annual data center revenue by 2035. Companies establishing credible quantum capabilities today are positioning for a market that will compound for decades. Companies still resolving foundational scientific questions about their core hardware approach are not in the same position as those that have moved past those questions and are building commercial products. This is the pressure behind Microsoft's timeline acceleration. The announcement of Majorana 2 with a 2029 target came just months after sustained scientific skepticism of Majorana 1. The company clearly needs to demonstrate progress that the field accepts, not just progress it can announce. The post-quantum cryptography angle represents the part of the quantum story where ordinary businesses and governments face the most immediate obligation to act. The encryption protecting bank transactions, medical records, government communications, and personal data is built on mathematical assumptions a sufficiently powerful quantum computer could defeat. RSA, which secures most internet traffic, and elliptic curve cryptography, which secures financial transactions, are both vulnerable to Shor's algorithm running on a large enough quantum system. The harvest, now decrypt later threat, means adversarial actors are already collecting encrypted data today, intending to decrypt it once quantum hardware becomes capable enough. Every organization handling sensitive long-term data has a concrete obligation to begin migrating to post-quantum cryptographic standards now. NIST finalized those standards in August 2024. The migration path exists. Microsoft's own security team is now telling you the timeline is shorter than most organizations assumed. The deeper lesson in the Majorana 1 controversy is about the structure of incentives that governs how quantum computing companies communicate with the world. These companies compete for talent, investment, government contracts, and the narrative position that comes with being perceived as the leader in a technology that could reshape the global economy. Every one of those pressures pushes toward maximizing claims and minimizing caveats. Peer review is supposed to be the corrective mechanism that validates or invalidates those claims against actual evidence. But peer review operates on a timescale of months or years after the corporate announcement. By the time the formal scientific challenge appears in Nature, the stock has moved, the partnership deals have been signed, and the workforce has been reorganized around a program whose foundations may still be in dispute. This tension between the pace of corporate competition and the pace of scientific verification is not unique to quantum computing. But quantum computing is the current field where it is most visible and most consequential. The question of whether Microsoft's program will ultimately vindicate its 2-decade topological bet is genuinely open. Even the most skeptical researchers do not claim Majorana zero modes are impossible or that topological qubits cannot be built. What they claim is that Microsoft has not yet provided conclusive evidence, and that this is not the first time it has made claims that had to be walked back. Majorana 2 may deliver evidence strong enough to resolve the dispute. The 2029 timeline may prove accurate, or the scientific community may continue to find the evidence insufficient. What is not open is whether quantum computing poses a real threat to current encryption and a real opportunity for whoever builds the first commercially useful, fault-tolerant quantum computer. That question is settled. The threat is real, the opportunity is real, and the race to claim it is being run right now by companies whose claims deserve to be read against the scientific record, not just the press release.